This is RDNA 4 on my desk. AMD's reeled the pricing, $599, just $50 cheaper, $549 for the 9070. Bottom line, AMD's done it. This gen-on-gen ray tracing uplift is great, but the gen-on-gen raster performance, real frames, real performance, that is the best it's been in a long time. Significant frame per dollar increases, I guess. Think of the 9070 XT like the 7900 XTX. But double-ish the ray tracing performance of the 7900 XTX. Ray tracing viable on AMD finally? Yeah, basically. The 9070 being only $50 cheaper, though, is a little weird. So we need to talk about that. Now, I've got the ASUS Prime 9070 and 9070 XT. These are both stellar cards. They actually basically look identical. And we're going to do a deep dive on their performance. And strangely, it has 3 8-pin power connectors. Oh, I've also got the Sapphire 9070 XT. But that's over on the Linux channel, so be sure to check that out too. Because Linux, it's AMD, of course. Let's get into it. Now, I'm just a gamer. I want a good gaming GPU. Okay, at around $600, the 9070 XT is, in the otherwise vast wasteland of unobtainable overpriced GPUs, the least bad option. It's actually a pretty good option, unless the actual price from AMD is also divorced from reality, as it is with competing cards. Although Micro Center has a significant stock of these cards already, way more than they had NVIDIA on launch. So yeah, otherwise this is going to be legendary. Legendary how? Like the RX 480. This is a legendary card from AMD. I had it here somewhere. It's Polaris architecture. It's 10 years old, but there's a lot of people that still remember the RX 480 fondly. It was an amazing value, and it was really good, and blah, blah, blah. Or macroeconomic conditions, $600, I don't know. Anyway, the 9070 and the 9070 XT, what have we got here? Well, check out the overview. These cards each have 16 gigs of 20 gigabit GDDR6 on a 256-bit memory bus. And the cards themselves, well, they're a speedy PCIe Gen 5, use the full 16 lanes. The XT is a 304 watt board power, but it's also overclockable, and so it'll use significantly more power if you overclock it, as evidenced by, it doesn't need 3, 2 would be fine. The 9070, of course, is 220 watts. The XT, really the XT overclocking headroom is pretty significant. I had less luck overclocking the 9070. Now, the 9070 XT is clocked at 2.4 gigahertz and can boost up to 2.97, while the 9070 is clocked at 2.07 and can boost to just 2.5. Real world, in a lot of games, it doesn't make as much difference as you might think, but in some games, it makes a huge difference. So it just depends. 9070's 56 ray accelerators and 56 compute units, whereas the XT has the full 64. So 56 versus 64, you just do the math, and that's where it lands in some games, but not all. As I'm sure a lot of you out there already know, AMD figures, and macroeconomic conditions notwithstanding, we are nearing an upgrade cycle. And so AMD's trying, I think, really hard to get a lot of gamers that are, on that Steam hardware survey. They're still using gaming hardware that's 3 or more generations out of date. And so these cards promise a considerable performance uplift from cards that are that old, 2 to 4 times the raw frame rate and much higher settings that I'm sure gamers are enjoying now on those older cards wouldn't be an unreasonable expectation upgrading to these cards, depending on what you're upgrading from in that era, of course. Of course, from that era, GPUs on average were quite a bit less expensive. Our ASUS cards are nearly identical, same size and length, 2.5 slot card. There's a diagram on the box that makes it look like a 2-slot card. That's a little misleading. It's actually 2 slots and a bit. So 2.5 slot, 3 slot. It's got to be able to breathe, I think, is what they were going for there. The card does have plenty of breathability with its 3 fans and a flow-through design for the back part of the card. So yeah, and the cooling is very, very effective, keeping the temperatures of the card very low in both cases. Now, for the gaming benchmarks, yeah, we'll get to those, but let's talk other RDNA features first. Other big feature improvements for RDNA 4 is encoder-decoder improvements, and particularly with OBS recording. OBS recording at 6 megabit was something they called out in the press release, and something that I can verify. It is dramatically better than it's ever been. FSR 4 is also improved. It's a machine learning powered upscaler that supports 3 modes: quality, balanced, and performance. So that's not really, I mean, I guess it always did quality, balance, and performance, but it's a machine learning model and it's a lot better. At 4x scale for the performance mode, I mean, not really a lot has changed with how the scaling works over previous versions of FSR in terms of like real pixels to upscaled pixels. If your starting resolution is 1080p, I think is when it works best. So if you start with 1080p and you upscale to 1440p, or you're upscaling to 4K, but the quality and balanced presets I think are the most useful. I did most of my subjective in-game testing at 4K native resolution on that Gigabyte OLED display running at 240 hertz. I reviewed that separately. You should check that out. FSR 4 supports a significant number of games on launch, more than AMD ever has on launch, but it's still maybe could be more. There's a lot of games here. It's nice to see this though. AMD is, GPU open, and all the stuff that AMD is doing with that is great. And FSR 4 can also do frame gen, not multi-frame gen like NVIDIA, just frame gen. And that's not really new for this generation, but there are some improvements for FSR 4 which can translate into performance for frame gen. I mean, with its technologies, you can go from 90 FPS in Baldur's Gate 3 native 4K on the glorious OLED to about 200 FPS with the same, to my eye, image quality and animation. That's frame gen, and it's basically just one click in HyperRX from Adrenaline. And visually, is really like just playing the game, you can't really tell the difference. You really got a pixel peep to see it. So, okay, on to the benchmarks. Good thing this card launched today, so we can compare all of the cards. First, let's start with artificial benchmarks. Firestrike, look at that. It's pretty close to the 5070 Ti, and the 9070 is well ahead of the Founders Edition 5070. Very nice to see. This is looking promising. What about TimeSpy? Let's take a look at TimeSpy. The performance is very similar to the 7900 XTX. Is that foreshadowing for the rest of this review? I think it might be. A little bit, sort of, kind of. And the 9070 even pulls well ahead of the Founders Edition 5070. And the Founders Edition 5070's got 4 gigs less VRAM. Port Royal? Well, the 9070 XT and the 9070 are performing well in Port Royal. So this result's about what I would expect. Nothing remarkable here. For Puget Bench and Premiere, it's Premiere Photoshop testing, AMD is behind NVIDIA's offerings. They just couldn't quite match the performance there. They couldn't even match the performance of their own 7900 XTX. Possibly future software optimizations might improve this, but for now, not so much. Similarly, the Geekbench results for both Vulkan and OpenCL were perhaps a bit surprising. I might have expected better performance from our Geekbench artificial benchmarks, especially from the Vulkan benchmark. Vulkan should run pretty well on this GPU, I would expect. Okay, that's enough of the artificial benchmarks. Let's take a look at actual real games. Starting with Cyberpunk 2077, of course. First with ray tracing disabled on the Ultra preset. The results here for both cards, the 9070 XT and the 9070, are pretty respectable. 1440p and 1080p were both playable on basically every setup you could want. 4K was playable on the 9070 XT, but it was much more enjoyable with slightly dialed down settings because 61 FPS average isn't bad, but this OLED monitor is spoiling me. And the frame rate is pretty steady overall, 43 FPS for the 1% lows, but I would have liked to have seen more performance at 4K on the Ultra preset because the Ultra preset also includes some, baked in stuff. Comparing the 5070 Ti and the 5070 raster performance, the performance is closer than I might have expected. I really was expecting the AMD GPUs to pull more ahead here, but AMD still does come out ahead. Now, ray tracing. Cyberpunk and ray tracing. Historically challenging, known to be a little difficult. AMD, look at that. The 9070 XT is almost as good at ray tracing as the 5070 Ti. What kind of world is this? Ultra RT, 81 FPS at 1080p? Nice job, Team AMD. Good work. Entirely playable at 1440p as well. Even the 9070 manages 70 FPS at 1080p. This is a really impressive result. Horizon Forbidden West. Well, you might as well play at 1440p. 1080p isn't much faster than 1440p. Even 4K is quite playable at 85 FPS with the 9070. Again, this is a pretty impressive result. If we dip into balanced upscaling with the very high preset leveraging FSR 4, because this game supports it, the game looks great and is quite playable. I threw in some more tests against FSR3 with the 7900 XTX, which looks worse and performs somewhat worse as well. Huge props to the AMD team for most improved GPU generation, gold star. This game was particularly enjoyable on the OLED at 137 FPS in native 4K, beating the 5070 Ti by a pretty decent margin. Monster Hunter Wilds, well, that's setting some Steam records for concurrent players, isn't it? The 5070 Ti and the 9070 XT are neck and neck. Interestingly, the 5070 Ti does a little better versus the 9070 XT at 4K, but the 9070 XT is faster than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and 1080p. Even the 9070 is faster than the 5070 Ti at 1080p, but the 9070 it can't keep up. It can't deliver 60 FPS at 4K, whereas the XT can. So this is a pretty interesting result, I think. Now, Monster Hunter with ray tracing on the Ultra preset, basically everything struggles to deliver 60 FPS at 4K, but the performance at 1440p and 1080p is similar for most of these cards, except the plain 5070 Founders Edition, which falls well behind. And it can't even deliver, it can only just barely deliver 60 FPS at 1440p. Well, it's doing a little better than the 4070, but, it's not doing great here. Silent Hill 2 Remake, the Epic preset, well, no card is playable at 4K, but the 1440p and 1080p performance is decent. I think I'd probably play this title at 1080p on the 9070 and 1440p on the 9070 XT, at least if I really wanted to play on the Epic preset. You can dial down the settings and get a little better performance, of course. Now, if you turn on ray tracing, well, the 9070 XT delivers here 64 FPS at 1080p, and the 9070 can do 59. The NVIDIA 5070 Ti still pulls ahead here at 1080p, but the gap closes up at 1440p. I don't know that I'd consider the 1440p frame rates playable, let alone 4K, but this is an entirely reasonable result, in my opinion. Warhammer 40K Ultra, 72 FPS for the 9070 XT and 52 FPS for the 9070. And it's not a bad showing here. 1440p or with upscaling was much more enjoyable, though. I mean, yeah. With Ultra and upscaling, I only noticed minor fall off in quality, and the performance was impressive from AMD. AMD was surprisingly strong here with Warhammer. This is another title that supports FSR4, and FSR4 worked well in this title in terms of image quality and basically delivering on AMD promises. We decided to test Warhammer performance across all of the FSR4 options. So this gives you an idea of how the performance can scale. And the relative performance difference between the XT and the non-XT. I mean, for a $50 price difference between cards, these are significant performance gaps. So, I mean, pretty much in all scenarios, you'd want the more expensive card. I hope this means that the 9070 will come down in price as the volume increases, or AMD is just hoping that everybody's going to buy an XT and there's not really going to be a lot of 9070s in stock. I'm not really sure. We'll see. Outside gaming benchmarks, what about AI and other features? Well, AMD also added AMD Chat, which is a language model. It's a large language model, but it's a small large language model. And you can ask it questions about your GPU, like what is the GPU temperature? Or where can I find the GPU temperature? Or how do I monitor the GPU temperature? What steps can I take to optimize a game? AMD Chat can also do image generation, so it's got a little stable diffusion model there. It's an interesting take. It's an interesting feature. It'll be interesting to see if gamers use this feature and how much it gets. AMD's also added an opt-in diagnostic thing that uses AI to detect a crash or a game rendering anomaly. So you can use that and elect to send back a screenshot or crash or image anomaly, which AMD will use to help improve the quality of their graphics drivers. I actually think this is kind of innovative, especially if you opt into it. It's like, hey, my game's doing something weird. Let me show you. And it'll say, it'll just help AMD sort of figure out what is actually doing weird. So that's nice. It would be nice if there was support for more advanced AI functionality with these, but there's no ROCm support. And there's actually some interesting stuff with the AI support, and there's a lot of AI performance, and it supports the integer formats for AI, but the software is just not there yet. There's some interesting stuff on the Linux review for that as well. In our AI testing with Procyon, the 9000 series cards at the bottom of the stack is not entirely unexpected, but perhaps a little disappointing. They wouldn't be at the bottom of the stack if the software were fully in place because of the raw performance, the AI tops, they're there. Now let's talk overclocking. There's automatic overclocking on these cards, which works really well. You can also do manual overclocking, and there's also some presets. Automatic overclocking, because it is overclocking, your mileage is going to vary, but I'm going to cover that at least on the forum, but maybe in a future video, because I did have significantly more overclocking headroom here than I expected. AMD also has some presets for efficiency, so if you're not interested in overclocking, you're interested in underclocking, AMD's got the message loud and clear, and I could save about 50 watts on the XT easily with only a minor loss in performance. I was surprised by how much OC headroom there was, though. Like the 9070 XT and ASUS's cooling seems to be really up to the challenge. If you want to dump more like 400 watts, 450 watts in your card, you can get some more performance out of it. There's also a toggle switch on this card that toggles between performance and quiet modes. Unless you're overclocked, there's really not a lot of audible difference between performance and quiet. It was only about 1.5 dB. But when you overclock, three fans, it'll move a significant amount of air, but it really seems to only matter on an overclock profile. An overclock could drive a fair bit more noise than without an overclock, at least between the performance and the quiet mechanical switch. But your mileage may vary, again, there, because overclocking. If you're interested in that, join us on the forum. We'll talk about that. A lot more interesting stuff going on over there. And for others considering these GPUs, I think you should post your overclocking experiences if you pick one up. I don't know if I've got a unicorn or if AMD opted to tune it in a little bit more on the efficiency side or like overclocking. I don't really know. But if you post your results in the forum or just say, hey, this is what I did, here's my profile, this works really well, everybody can benefit from that. So cool. Again, right now, sample size of 1, 2, 3. But, there you go. Now you saw the performance. The 9070 XT goes toe-to-toe with the 5070 Ti, especially with a small overclock. It's even a little bit better. AMD focused on raw raster performance for this generation, and this card looks like it's poised to come in significantly cheaper than NVIDIA's offerings. AMD drivers are better than they've ever been, and nothing that I saw in putting this review together would give me any pause about flakiness or reliability, or that this card is, if anything, undersold and over-delivered, which is fantastic to see. The 9070 is a much better value than the 5070 for sure. 16 gigs of VRAM versus only 12 on the 5070 to start, but the 9070 is enough slower than the 9070 XT. The pricing is kind of baffling. You probably should just opt for the 9070 XT. And it may be that in production, like this is the version of the silicon that has problems. There may just not be enough of those. The quality may be good. Now, what if the cards are really far off of MSRP? Well, the 9070 pricing would make more sense, I think, around $499 or $449. But I don't know. I don't know what street pricing is going to be. Right now, competing cards are either hard to obtain or priced much higher than what the retail price is supposed to be. So if these are actually at the advertised prices, $599 and $549, they're a lot better value. I think AMD's gambling a little bit here, though, with the pricing reality versus NVIDIA's suggested MSRP, because these are a much more compelling buy if you can't actually buy NVIDIA cards. But what if NVIDIA turns up the supply? Then AMD might be in a more difficult position, somewhat. AMD's software stack does not have any feature parity for AI features, and NVIDIA Broadcast is interesting and has a lot of interesting features in the AI, more than just, audio. It's like stream audio improvement. And you probably wouldn't be buying a 5070 or a 5070 Ti to do CUDA experiments anyway, so I don't know how much of a downside that is. CUDA is NVIDIA's AI stuff. If you're going to do AI, you're probably going to buy the 5090 with 32 gigs of VRAM. But still, it's kind of weird that there's no ROCm Day 1 support for these AMD cards, because even if gamers don't plan to use these features for AI, they do have the AI tops and they do have the formats to be able to support them. I suppose game companies could implement AI features. AMD doesn't have multi-frame gen, and we know that NVIDIA has hardware for doing multi-frame gen frame pacing to make the experience a little bit more smooth, and those are fundamentally smoothing features. Now, AMD does have frame gen, just not multi-frame gen, and NVIDIA's upscaling model is still superior to FSR4 as far as I can tell, but FSR4 gets the job done. FSR4 is also a machine learning model, but I think AMD is not quite there yet. With NVIDIA, you're buying some card, some GPU, and some software. Whereas AMD has focused most of their efforts on optimizing the price of the hardware with much more raw performance, as much raw performance as possible. And so they are fundamentally different philosophical approaches about how these companies are approaching their products. And it's a bit of a divergence because they're focusing on different things, you see. With the gen-on-gen uplift of NVIDIA cards around this price point, I think it was a little disappointing, especially around raster performance, especially for gamers that pay attention to such things. AMD's ray tracing performance, gen-on-gen, is impressive, is seriously impressive. It's improved a lot more as ray tracing gets integrated into more and more games. But the performance still isn't quite at parity with the 5070 Ti. So that's, again, another thing that AMD is going to have to work on. If the supply of NVIDIA cards available at MSRP increases significantly, then $599 and $549 prices are not quite as aggressive. But it's still a pretty big difference. Even if you got a 5070 Ti at retail, $599 is still fairly aggressively priced. But if you want DLSS 4 features or better ray tracing, it's probably still in NVIDIA's court. FSR4 upscaling's algorithm is the best that AMD has ever had, but in my estimation, it lands somewhere between DLSS 3 and DLSS 4. It's a little better than DLSS 3 in the titles that I tested it in, but not quite on DLSS 4 level. So I think AMD has some work to do there. But if you don't agree with the philosophical differences, the divergence, the direction that NVIDIA is taking games with FrameGen, because they're the incumbent technology right now, and the way that they're doing upscaling and AI frames and all that, then there has never been a better time to vote with your wallet. AMD has managed to not only deliver 7900 XTX performance for like $400 cheaper, but they're doing it and still giving enough margin to their board partners like ASUS that ASUS will make good cards and sell them, and they're happy with the margin that they're making on this card versus a competing product. I mean, ASUS is going to make money either way, so ASUS doesn't really care. AMD is putting a lot into this, and I think the future of AMD's GPU work depends on how successful this generation is. But big kudos to AMD's engineering team. I mean, I think we need a monster flagship 32 gig card that combines CDNA and RDNA. Let's call it UDNA and call it one monster enthusiast card. Just take like 2 or 4 of these and glue them together, and let's get it done, because AMD is exceptionally good at gluing things together. That is awesome. I'm Wendell. This is Level 1. This has been a quick look at the 9070 XT and the 9070. If you have any questions or you want to see other testing, check out the Linux video. All right, I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums.